you. Okay, we are good. It shows, let me check the live. Yes, we are live now. Okay. Good evening. Welcome everybody to lecture number 4, the last in the series of 5 lecture series in USA, celebrating Worldwide Ayurveda Day on the platform of Council for Ayurveda Research. I will be introducing Dr. Vaidya Meenakshi Gupta, who will be introducing our speaker for today. Vaidya Meenakshi Gupta is an internationally renowned Ayurveda expert, classically trained Vaidya, holistic practitioner, founder CEO of Roots Ayurveda Wellness in the Dallas area. She's a brand ambassador for Unilever Ayurveda hair care brand Indulekha. She has more than 5 years of extensive teaching experience at Ayurveda colleges in India and more than 18 years of extensive teaching experience in the USA, and she has been practicing for more than 20 years. Over to you, Dr. Meenakshi.
Thank you, Dr. Pratibha. Hello and namaste, everyone. On behalf of Council for Ayurveda Research, we welcome you to the 4th lecture of the lecture series we present to celebrate Ayurveda Day. A little about Council for Ayurveda Research. CAR is a pioneering initiative to promote and establish Ayurveda as an evidence-based health science globally. One of our core goals is to create a platform for the exchange, interaction, and integration of information, competency, expertise, and resources between apex academic institution, researcher, practitioners, and students in USA as well as in other countries to facilitate Ayurvedic research of the highest global standards. So today is the 4th lecture of the lecture series we present to celebrate Ayurveda Day. Every year on Dhanvantri Day, we pay our respect to Ayurveda sages who handed down this science of life to benefit humanity. And this year, Dhanvantri Day is falling on November 13th. Council for Ayurveda Research is proud to be a global partner of the worldwide initiative to celebrate Ayurveda Day. Ayurveda embodies the principle of natural and sustainable living, and this year the celebration is specifically aimed at promoting the United Nations World Health Organization Sustainable Development Goal 3, which is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages. And for today's lecture, we have Dr. Diana Lurie, who is going to talk about the intersection of Ayurveda and circadian rhythm. Dr. Diana, Ph.D., is a professor of neuropharmacology at the University of Montana. She received her Ph.D. in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania and directs a research laboratory focusing on neuroinflammation and the response of nervous system to natural products, including Ayurveda herbs. And Dr. Diana is a NAMA certified Ayurveda practitioner and teaches neuroscience, anatomy, physiology, and courses in Ayurveda. She is also the chair of NAMA Certification Board. So we welcome Dr. Diana Lurie to present today's presentation.
Thank you very much for such a nice introduction. And thank you, Pratibha, for the invitation and for all the good work that the Council of Ayurveda Research is doing. So I have lost the ability, oh, here we go, share my screen. Okay, so when Pratibha asked me to give a talk and I started thinking about the theme of this celebration, I started thinking about where we're going to be taking Ayurveda in the future and how we can intersect Ayurveda with biomedical science. And I think it's all become very clear to us, particularly through this pandemic, that our behavior and our lifestyle is really important in terms of our health and how we maintain our health. And so, So what I'm going to do today is talk about circadian rhythms because I think they're a very interesting intersection between Ayurveda and biomedical allopathic medicine as we move forward in the next decade. I kind of think of the 20th century as being the century of drug development, and how medicine really, allopathic medicine really moved into a heavy reliance on drugs. And I kind of foresee the 21st century as being one in which our behavioral modifications, our lifestyle, things that are non-pharmacological play a large role in our health and in maintaining our health. So circadian rhythms are a really good example of this. So what I'll do in the talk is define circadian rhythms, both at the biological and behavioral level. We'll talk a little bit about how circadian rhythms impact health and disease from a biomedical perspective. And I'm really going to focus on this newly evolving area of chrononutrition in biomedical research. And that is how what we eat and when we eat and how that relates to our health. So we'll talk about it in relation to disease, and then we'll talk about the ways in which Ayurveda supports this concept. And then I'll tie together some very basic Ayurvedic lifestyle recommendations in terms of daily routines with these circadian rhythms. And then at the end, I'll propose like some potential experiments that we could do to bring Ayurveda into this discussion of circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms are a really large topic, and I'm not going to cover all of it. I'm just going to give you kind of a brief overview. And in general, and at a very basic level, they regulate the function of cells, organs, systems, and behaviors. So we have activity rest cycles, we have feast famine cycles, we have a circadian rhythm to our immune system and inflammation, which is very interesting. They regulate our psychological state. For example, disruption of circadian rhythms can lead to depression. There's also a circadian rhythm in neurodegenerative diseases and in the function of our blood-brain barrier. But what I'm going to talk about today is how Ayurvedic daily routines around food and food intake and sleep patterns, and how this intersects with the biology of circadian rhythms. And really the theme of this lecture series that Karis put together really revolves around research and how can we bring research into supporting Ayurveda. And I would like to sort of postulate that there's actually a lot of biomedical research out there that supports Ayurveda. We just need to weave it into our concepts. And that's why I'm going to be talking about circadian rhythms, because there's quite a bit out there that we're beginning to understand about circadian rhythms. And the research is really supporting a lot of our Ayurvedic lifestyle recommendations. So for example, in Ayurveda, we recommend for sleep that you wake up 30 to 60 minutes before sunrise approximately, that you don't sleep a lot during the day, that you go to bed around 10 at a regular time, that you don't stay up too late, and that you maintain a regular sleep-wake routine. For food, very basically from an Ayurvedic perspective, we recommend that you eat your largest meal at noon, then eat a moderate dinner, reasonably early in the evening between 6 and 7. Don't eat at night, and then modify your food choices with the seasons. So these are very basic recommendations. And I'm going to show you through this talk how biomedical research in circadian rhythms really support all of these concepts. So what is a circadian rhythm? So circadian rhythms, they're cycles of behavior, metabolism, and gene expression that are created by an internal clock. And this governs a whole variety of metabolic functions. Things like glucose homeostasis, hepatic lipid metabolism, obesity, sleep, cardiovascular function, immune function. So really all of our physiology is ultimately tied in at some level with our circadian rhythms. And in humans, circadian rhythms are regulated in two ways. One is called a central clock, central regulation. And this is regulated by the central nervous system, by the brain. And it is basically triggered by light that comes in through your retina and is encoded in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of a nucleus called the hypothalamus in the brain. And the hypothalamus is a really interesting area of the brain because it integrates all kinds of metabolic function as well as our cognitive function. The other type of clock protein or circadian rhythm we have is actually in almost every single cell of our body. So our individual cells have a circadian rhythm, and these rhythms are encoded by what we call clock proteins, which are transcribed from clock genes. And I've just listed a couple of them here, clock, BMA1, to just show you that even at a very cellular level, the cells are cycling in the production of these clock proteins. So we refer to the brain regulating the circadian rhythm as our central clock, and we refer to the actual clock that's happening within the cells as our peripheral clocks. So why do we need a circadian rhythm? And it's kind of interesting when we think about it. Well, it prepares the body for events that happen throughout the day. Okay, so we need to regulate our hormone secretion, our renal blood flow, our body temperature, our sleep-wake cycles, our processes involving digestion. We want the body to be prepared for all the activities that it is going to encounter and engage in during the day. And there are a lot of them. This image here is from this paper here, and this paper is freely available. And you could see that the brain, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, is regulating the circadian rhythms that affect the lymph nodes, the lungs, our liver, our intestine, our digestion, exercise, fat storage. Almost every physiological function has some kind of circadian rhythm to it. Now, circadian rhythms change across the lifespan, and this is really interesting because this also ties in very closely with how we view changes within our doshas across the lifespan. So circadian rhythms first emerge during infancy, but they change over our lifespan. So for example, children go to sleep earlier and they wake earlier compared with adults. But this timing shifts to a later time during adolescence. And in older adults, it's really quite interesting that rhythm often returns to an earlier cycle where elderly people tend to go to sleep earlier and they wake earlier, but they often don't have as strong a circadian rhythm. Now, what happens when we disrupt the circadian rhythm in terms of sleep? So sleep loss and short sleep duration in very young kids, 2 to 5 years old, has been linked to things like inattentiveness, hyperactivity, frustration. And another dysfunction of our circadian rhythms occurs during something called social jet lag. And that's when you keep a very rigid schedule during the work week. So you might go to bed early and rise early because you have to get to work. But then on the weekend, you sleep in and you go to bed later, go to sleep later, and you wake up a lot later. And this is called social jet lag. And this is a disruption of the circadian rhythm. And in adolescence, this has been associated with an increase in risk-taking behaviors, in substance abuse, and even depression. So again, what can disrupt our circadian rhythms? Well, some of the most carefully studied disruptions are people that work on the night shift. So chronic shift work, night shift, and chronic jet lag in adults has been associated with a whole host of diseases. Not just sleep disorders, but cancer, obesity, heart disease, depression, diabetes. So working at times other than during the day can result in a 66% elevated risk for obesity and a 57% elevated risk for metabolic syndrome. And this is independent of exercise and what you're eating. Timing of eating too close to the rest period is also a disruptor for the circadian rhythm, meaning night eating or eating too late at dinner. So social jet lag we talked about, alcohol, diets high in fat, those can all disrupt our circadian rhythms. And then in older individuals, people 65 and up, have been shown to sleep less. They experience more nighttime awakening. They take longer to fall asleep, and they're more sleepy during the day. And another fact that's kind of interesting is that cataracts, if people have cataracts, which is the clouding of the lens, so you don't get as much light that's coming in through your retina, that can also affect circadian rhythms. So again, there's a whole host of physiological function that is involved with circadian rhythms, but I would like to focus on chrononutrition because it's a very interesting field that has really been emerging in the last 5 years or so. And basically what chrononutrition is the idea that the timing of eating and the dietary components, the components of your diet, can potentially modulate your circadian rhythms in the GI system, your gastrointestinal system, including the gut microbiome. So glucose metabolism, for example, in people follows a circadian rhythm. So glucose tolerance, which is the ability of glucose to move glucose from the blood into the tissue, so to get rid of glucose, peaks during the day when food consumption is occurring. And that makes sense, right? You're eating and you want to be able to move that glucose out of the bloodstream and into your tissues. But at night, that glucose tolerance is reduced. And that's usually when fasting is occurring. So your body isn't able to deal with glucose quite as well at night. And this is why, one of the main reasons why night eating is not considered to be something that's very healthy, because your body is not timed to deal with your glucose. So unusual meal timings, eating at night, eating very late at night, can cause what we call glucose intolerance because it's affecting the central circadian pacemaker, the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. And it also disrupts those little peripheral clocks in the cells of your liver and pancreas. Very interesting, right? Because Ayurveda says don't eat at night, don't eat a late dinner. So again, here is just a nice little picture showing, this is from Henry et al., showing you the timing and the nutrients of food intake. And if you're synchronized with your circadian rhythms, you have a better metabolic outcome, better glucose control, a more healthy BMI. If you eat out of sync with your circadian rhythms, then there can be a tendency towards type 2 diabetes, obesity, and poor glucose control. So another layer that from an allopathic biomedical point of view that factors into chrononutrition is chronotype. And chronotype is the behavioral expression of a person's unique internal circadian clock system. And basically what that means is, are you a morning person or are you an evening person? So morning chronotype wakes up earlier, goes to sleep earlier. An evening chronotype wakes up much later, goes to sleep much later. So if you're waking up later and going to sleep later, you're shifting all of that metabolic activity that would occur during the day, and you're shifting it towards the evening. So people with an evening chronotype are biologically driven to consume foods later in the day. And so they delay when they eat, and there's excessive food intake at night. There's a lot of night eating with the evening chronotype. And interestingly, they tend to skip breakfast. They have a lower adherence towards a healthy diet. They don't tend to eat as healthy as a morning chronotype would. They have a lower consumption of fruits and vegetables and proteins, and they seem to have a higher preference for sugary foods and beverages and alcohol. So what's interesting about this is that most of the studies that have looked at food intake and correlated that with chronotype concluded that the amount of energy and carbohydrates and fats didn't actually differ between the morning and the evening chronotype, but the evening chronotype consumes less energy in the morning and more energy in the evening. Skipping breakfast. So this is something that occurs with the evening chronotype. And there's a fairly strong association in the biomedical literature between skipping breakfast and insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. So for example, there was a study in US men and that showed that men who skipped breakfast had a 21% higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes than men who consumed breakfast. Another study, it was much smaller, looked at women who omitted breakfast. And those women omitting breakfast led to a significantly higher energy intake, a higher fasting and total LDL cholesterol, and lower postprandial insulin sensitivity, meaning they had a harder time after eating a meal disposing of the glucose. And remember this study because we're going to come back to it at the end of this talk. So what happens when there's a late evening meal? What happens when healthy people eat a late evening meal? So what happens is that the increase in blood glucose gets shifted towards later at night with the peak of blood glucose during sleep. So what happens is that a late evening meal could cause postprandial or after eating hyperglycemia. So you get a lot of glucose at a time when your circadian rhythm is actually ramping down your ability to deal with glucose. So you can't deal as well with the glucose. Having a late dinner after 8 o'clock is associated with an increase in HbA1c, which is a measure of your glucose. And this was true both in healthy individuals and in individuals with type 2 diabetes. And there has been quite a bit of work showing that type 2 diabetics have a different circadian pattern compared to healthy individuals. Again, with this increased insulin sensitivity at night and higher glucose elevations in the morning compared to the evening. Our composition of our meals can also disrupt our circadian rhythms. So the amount of calories consumed at breakfast and dinner actually seems to influence the daily rhythm of our post-meal glucose and insulin levels. When most of the day's calories are consumed at dinner, there's a twofold increase in diabetes in older men and women. In overweight or obese women, consuming more calories at breakfast actually resulted in greater reductions in fasting blood glucose and insulin compared to consuming more calories at dinner. So eating a bigger breakfast was actually beneficial. In type 2 diabetic patients, a high-calorie breakfast, a low-calorie dinner, was also associated with a reduction in this postprandial, post-meal hypoglycemia, and an increase in insulin for the whole day, which is a positive thing. So the timing of our meals, our composition of our meals, and then the types of proteins and fats and vegetables that and meats that we eat really make a difference as well. So increasing the amount of proteins in a meal can reduce our postprandial glucose at night, which is also a good thing. Consuming a healthy fat can also help to attenuate this rise in glucose after a meal. So for example, studies have looked at ingestion of olive oil before a potato meal seems to reduce the amount of glucose. A milk protein consumed before eating bread also has the same effect. And there's one study that looked at the timing of the different components of meal, and they found that consuming vegetables, then meat, and finally rice was the best sequence to kind of keep your blood glucose at a lower level without needing to make more insulin. And a recent study looked at catechin-rich green tea in the evening as something that was very beneficial in reducing postprandial glucose compared to a placebo type tea. Okay, so that's a little brief overview. So how do we tie this into Ayurveda, and how can we use these studies to support the practice of Ayurveda? So when we summarize what we know about circadian rhythms, you don't skip breakfast, you eat your largest meal at noon, you eat a moderate dinner between 6 and 7, and you don't eat at night. And those are very basic concepts from Ayurveda. And as you can see, just with this brief overview, our understanding of circadian rhythms supports every single one of these concepts. Now, one of the things that I think is missing from this discussion is the concept of Prakriti. And I think Ayurveda offers a really important framework and an important lens through which we can refine and personalize some of these concepts. And I thought it might be fun to kind of end this discussion with a couple of ways that maybe we could design some experiments to weave Ayurveda into these concepts. So let's just take chronotype and dosha. And one could have the hypothesis that a late chronotype is associated with a dominant dosha. Perhaps kapha, who knows? So to run this experiment, you might decide, okay, I'm going to recruit a number of healthy subjects. You'd need to decide what age group you're going to recruit the subjects from. You're going to decide on your inclusion criteria, male, female, age, etc. You probably want to start out with about 45 to 60 subjects. You'd administer a dosha questionnaire to each subject or ascertain their dominant dosha. And in an ideal world, it would be nice to use a standardized questionnaire so other researchers could use that and replicate your findings. But you basically take your subjects, you'd analyze their dosha, either through a questionnaire or some other way that you want to do that. You could administer a chronotype questionnaire to all the participants. And then with somebody sort of blinded, you would sort your participants into 3 groups, maybe Vata dominant, Pitta dominant, Kapha dominant, and then analyze using a correlation analysis. Is there a chronotype that's associated? So you could determine how many participants in each dosha group are morning versus evening chronotypes. So that's just a experiment that doesn't require a lot of equipment, a lot of science. It's really based on questionnaires. But wouldn't it be great if Ayurveda could add something to this discussion of chronotype? And then another experiment, which would be much more difficult to do, you'd have to be more at a medical center, would be to go back to our study of 10 women who omitted breakfast and had this result of an increase in postprandial insulin levels and fasting and total LDL cholesterol. And one might, for example, make the hypothesis perhaps kapha dominant women can skip breakfast with no adverse effects on glucose metabolism. So you would follow the protocol that's outlined in the paper by Farshi et al., but you would sort your subjects into groups by dosha dominance. And then you would look at some of the physiological parameters. Now, this was a really complex study that looked at a lot of physiological parameters, but the largest effects that they found were on fasting and total LDL cholesterol and postprandial insulin levels. So you might want to just focus on those parameters. So those are just some ideas of how to take literature in, for example, circadian rhythms and overlay that with Ayurveda. And this is so important because evidence-based research is necessary for supporting Ayurveda as a medical practice within the allopathic medical community. But conducting a research study is challenging. It's not easy. And if you're a clinical practitioner, time is definitely an issue. I live in Missoula, Montana, which is a small town, and we would be the site for rural clinical trials here, but all of our physicians are so busy in their practice that they don't really have time to participate. So I think a way that we can start bringing Ayurveda into the allopathic community is, one way is by case studies. And don't underestimate the power of case studies. I think those are so important. Another thing to think about is find areas of intersection with biomedical research like circadian rhythms, and consider collaborative projects with researchers. And then don't reinvent the wheel. Conduct a study that adds an Ayurvedic perspective to a previously published research study, like some of the studies we discussed. And then finally, writing review articles, and Dr. Anu gave a very nice overview of a review article that can summarize the published biomedical studies, for example, circadian rhythm studies, that lend support to our Ayurvedic practices. So I think there are a lot of ways to bring in research and to interweave our knowledge of biomedical research with our knowledge of Ayurveda. And it doesn't have to be large studies. It doesn't necessarily have to be studying herbs. But I think as we move forward, lifestyle and lifestyle interventions are going to be increasingly important in maintaining our health. And Ayurveda has such a nice framework for that. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I am happy to take some questions if anybody has any.
Wonderful presentation, Dr. Diana.
Thank you.
And I completely agree with you that various case studies also can be helpful when it comes to the research. And that building up the data itself is a powerful tool through the case study, which can be very, very helpful. So
yes, and I've found in the medical literature, actually, we think that you have to have these huge studies, but a lot of medical practice I found in allopathic medicine, the physicians are citing case studies. They use case studies as guidance for how they practice clinically. So I think they're very important.
Yes.
So
and I think,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, and I think it's also important for Ayurvedic practitioners and Ayurvedic physicians here in the United States to have a knowledge of some of the basic science and some of the biomedical research around some of these concepts, like the gut microbiome and circadian rhythms, and that will allow them to support their Ayurvedic concepts to their patients and their community.
Right. I just posted on Facebook also. So if people have questions, I'm sure they will chime in.
Okay.
I actually got a call from the embassy while your talk was going on. So I missed the latter part of it a little bit before the conclusion part. But otherwise, extremely insightful, I would say. And today morning's talk was also sort of on similar lines from India, Kishore Patwardhan. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yeah.
BHU professor. So it's all available on Facebook in the live sessions. The whole talk is available. But I think this is exactly what we need in terms of correlating what we know from the ancient texts with what we are learning now. So I think in the morning we had a very nice discussion that and I was also actively participating in that. I think one of the things that I shared in the morning was that Ayurveda and modern medicine principles are not confrontational. It's just a different way of looking at the same thing. In the modern science, there is a certain template that we have been conditioned to think along, but that doesn't mean there are not other ways of thinking. And fortunately, we have this entire compendium of a different framework, different approach, different way of looking things. However, the understanding remains the same. In fact, now that we are beginning to find mechanisms, how things impact the body, like circadian rhythms, choices, food choices, small things, small changes in our daily choices, it's probably turning out that Ayurvedic approach or framework is probably broader and deeper.
Mhm.
It kind of embraces the complexity of the human physiology. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, and I think that we've actually moved away from that. You know, there's a saying, right, in the United States, early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. And I think what's happened in our era of drug development is that we've gotten away from the importance of our lifestyle and what we
Yes,
eat and how we live our lives. And I really anticipate moving back towards that more in this century. And I have to say, you know, the pandemic is a terrible example of this, right? Because we don't have drugs yet, we don't have a vaccine yet. We're still trying to figure out how to manage it. And what we have at our disposal is our behavior. You know, whether we wear masks, whether we
absolutely.
stay socially distant, whether we maintain small social circles. And that has really been the way that we are trying to deal with this disease right now. And some
Exactly.
people
Well
are
said.
doing it more successfully than others, you know.
Well said. Well said. So there's the, it's like, recently I was doing a talk, and one thing that the example that I gave was, if we have invasion from Mars today,
Mhm.
we don't know what Martians look like. We don't know what their capabilities are. We don't know what their arsenal is. But we are not going to sit twiddling our thumbs. We're going to look inside the house. What do we have?
Mhm.
We won't wait for what we don't have.
Right.
We'll bring a
Right.
stick, we'll bring a shoe, we'll bring
Mhm.
a knife, whatever it is, we'll bring. So I think that in some ways is happening in on different levels. One is that we are not just the consumers, but also the medical fraternity is kind of forced to relook at the what are called the alternate systems, and within our own individual capacities also, we are beginning to look what is that which we can boil on the stove
Mhm.
and consume, or what is it that we can do little differently in terms of our eating and lifestyle choices. So I think it's many opportunities have come out, many learnings, enlightenment has come out of are continuing to come out through this pandemic, even though these are terrible times. But there is, on the other hand, a lot of people are cooking at home now.
Mhm. Mhm.
Many things are changing. The earth is breathing more, there's better
Mhm.
air quality. So many good
Yeah.
changes have come about. I think collectively it's a time for introspection on many levels, not just what we have done, what we are doing to ourselves, but also what are the things we have in our arsenal, in our knowledge base, which we have not utilized so far. So I think in some ways these are good times as well. let's
Mhm.
let's see how ultimately things turn out. But
Yeah.
this scientific language and interface, I think, is what is going to strengthen um, what Ayurveda is saying, rather than just Ayurveda saying that
Right.
this, yeah, it has more teeth, it has more leg to stand on. Once we have these kind of data,
Mhm.
and all the presentations that have happened on car platform this whole week have been very, very enlightening. So this is very encouraging, because if we have more such activities, I'm sure more such information will come out, where the language starts getting better and better and better, and we actually have scientific background to some of the known principles of Ayurveda, which is exciting. I
It is
feel
exciting.
they're
You know, the more
exciting
I look
times.
into different areas of biomedical research, the more I can relate it to Ayurveda. So I
Yeah.
would really encourage those of us that are involved in Ayurveda to, you know, we have to get out of our comfort zones and start looking at the biomedical literature, and a lot of it is freely available on PubMed. So we have a responsibility to our profession to do that.
Are there any tips you would like to give? How one, is there any particular method to look up on PubMed, or just keywords, or
Just
Are there?
keywords, you know,
Okay.
I use Google Scholar and PubMed, and I just put in phrases that I'm interested in. And there's quite a lot out there. If anything has been, any research has used NIH funds, then it has to be freely available after a year. And many
Right.
journals are open now, much more so than in the past.
Hmm.
So it's, you know, you could probably get about 85% of the articles that you were interested in.
That's
And Google
wonderful.
Scholar is also another a good way to just start looking things up. And I tend to start with review articles. So I'll put my little phrase in and then say and review. And
Oh.
so you start with the review articles.
So can you
And
give an
that,
example of a phrase? How would you exactly type?
you know, circadian rhythm and review. I would start with
Oh,
that.
okay. Very
Or, you know, the
nice.
gut microbiome, circadian rhythm and review. Or the immune system, circadian rhythm and review. And so I always start with the review articles because that summarizes the studies.
Oh,
And
that's
then
very
if I
good.
want to go in and get more detail about a particular study, I'll go look up the study that's referenced in the review article. But starting with a review article is a really good way to go. It
Okay.
gives you a nice overview of the area that you're interested in.
So you're talking about systematic review?
Not even systematic reviews.
Okay.
No, because these
Just
are just summaries of what's
okay.
in the literature. So I
Mhm.
know Anu was talking about systematic reviews, and that systematic reviews are a little bit different. They're trying to show an effect
Hmm.
of an intervention.
Hmm.
And so what a systematic review is you look at all the research that's been published, all the different studies, and then you pick out the studies that meet your criteria,
Hmm.
and then you summarize those and say, based on that, this intervention helps. Yoga
Hmm.
is effective for back pain.
Hmm.
And that's different than just a review article of, okay, what's out there? What's the recent work? What are people thinking about circadian rhythms and the
Got
GI
it.
system?
Hmm. Good.
And so if you get a couple, you know, you've read enough articles, review articles, when they start using the same studies in them.
I
So,
think
you know,
that is helpful.
yeah.
Yeah, the word review is something that I will take home with me today because, of course, I also do a lot of scouring on Google, on PubMed with whatever keywords I want to look up with. But I think the what you're saying that just add review there will help maybe broaden or get you the summaries from which you can then
Yes,
choose which ones you want to read in more detail. I think that's a very good
exactly.
way to go about it.
Yeah, because the research, there's so much out there
There's so
and
much
it's
out there.
overwhelming.
Yes,
And,
yes.
you know, what people have done in these review articles is really summarize the best of the research and the more seminal research.
Hmm.
So I always do that when I'm researching a new area. I start with the review
I think
articles.
that's a very good tip, right, Meenakshi? That's
Yeah,
a
that's really
something
wonderful tip,
new. I think
especially
review. I had
for
not been
new
including the word
people
review.
and
That
for
would
us
be very
also.
helpful.
Yes.
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 One more question, Dinah. On PubMed, it's easy to look up, and you know you will probably be able to search there if you know what you want. But if one wants to remain abreast with the emerging information, like what's new out there, are
Mm-hmm.
there any portals, any websites, especially regarding physiology, molecular biology, because those are the hot fields right now. We're learning
Yeah.
so much. So is there a
So,
place we can keep abreast? Because the new things, even if we know the abstract, it's very
mhm.
helpful to know that what are the areas where, you know, new research is being done.
Yeah, so there are some services that kind of summarize that. And one of them is Medscape,
Mhm.
and they have different topics. And so you can sign up and you say what areas you're interested in, and then they'll email you. They're almost like little news briefs about a study. So they'll give you the original study, but they're little summaries. So I do it for neurology, for pharmacy, for and so you get sort of the latest news.
And I think there is a Lancet also, which
Sorry.
does the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is it expensive to subscribe to Medscape?
You know, it's free. I do it through the. I think
Oh,
it's free. I don't know.
Meenakshi, is it free?
Free. It is free. Lancet is also free because
Yeah.
when I was doing the certification of nutrition science from Stanford, that time, whatever the paid articles were, also I was able to access. But there are many free articles, and now they regularly send me the newsletter. The way that Diana was saying, it is kind of like a with every article link based upon
Some news is
have
there
picked
of
up.
upcoming.
Yeah, I'm just.
Okay.
Whoa, hold on a second. I've lost my light. Okay, I have.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
let me. Do you want to see an example?
Yeah, sure. You want to share your screen and
Yeah. So let
that'll be
me
nice.
find it. Here we go. So this is Medscape Daily News, and so how fit, you know, here are some of the articles that come in, and so you can decide what you want to. So here, let's just say face masks may be hurting. Can you see this now?
Yes.
Yeah. So it just gives you a little bit of an overview of what's happening.
That's
And
interesting topic.
yeah. So that's what Medscape does. And so when you sign up for Medscape, like I said, you choose the areas that you want to get alerts on. And so you'll get an email with a number of different topics in it. And that's how I've kept up with some of the research in COVID-19 and some of the new treatments, because it comes through my Medscape.
So as a primary researcher, Dinah, what are your research habits? How many do you go through? Like, do you have like I have to go through like 3, 4 papers every day. That's how I'm going to, because it's information overload in
No,
today's time.
maybe I should. I used to when the amount of literature was smaller. So there were a few journals that I would always look at, for my field, but I find it really overwhelming now because there's so much out there. And so I tend to do it on a as needed basis. So if I'm giving talks, or if I'm lecturing, or if I'm teaching, or in my research, if I'm working on a paper, or I'm trying to figure out how to design an experiment, I do it very, it's very sort of task oriented. I think that if you're not in an academic setting, I would, I'd go to PubMed and look for reviews every couple of weeks.
I think that
or
makes
however,
sense.
at least once a month. I mean, however much time that you have, because there's a lot of work that's published, but in science we have the publish or perish, and so everything gets published, every little thing gets published, and sometimes it can be overwhelming. And so you need time for these studies to percolate through the community and either be validated or not validated. And so that's why I like the review articles to start with, because
that's a good trick.
Process of vetting has already happened.
That's really good. One last question for you, unless Meenakshi has any other. Well, one quick last question for you, Diana, that if, and we have been trying to get work started on this, but if, because case studies are being identified as the most suitable, at least for now. And then, we have also worked on the case study I had published, etc. You remember the middle ear?
Yeah.
So if there are like specific disease areas, for example, I have a Graves' disease case which I would like to write case study and publish. How does one find what are the the scales, or the assessment parameters for that? Like, what are the things? How do we? Is there a place where we can find the assessment um, requirements for disease-wise?
Oh, you mean for like how you would write it up?
No, like for grace, for example, for fibromyalgia or arthritis, we
Mm-hmm.
would be using standard pain scales, and
Oh,
there
yeah, yeah,
are
yeah.
three for quality of life. So those are
Right.
like mandatory when you're doing arthritis. You have to do
Mm-hmm.
those three, four scales assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm quoting a slightly not so commonly encountered disease. Graves' disease is not something you encounter
Mm-hmm.
very frequently. Is there a portal where one can look disease wise? What are some of the
Yeah,
things I should be reporting to the?
right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that your best approach is to look at other case studies of Graves' disease
Hmm.
and see what they've assessed.
Lovely. I
Because
think
there's
I might.
never a standard, everybody's doing
Hmm.
things a little bit differently. So
Hmm.
that would be my approach, is look at some case studies that have been published on
I
Graves'
think that's an
disease.
excellent suggestion.
Mm,
Yeah.
and then just
All
do
right.
what they do. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much, Diana.
Mhm.
This was very informative, and we have recorded it for posterity. So, thank you so much for sharing
All right. Thank you.
what you have been learning or what's been coming your way. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Dr. Meenakshi, you want to make some announcements?
Yes, definitely. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Diana. I learned a
Thank
lot,
you.
especially in the field of the research. There is one important announcement regarding tomorrow. Tomorrow, November 13th, we have the special program to celebrate Ayurveda Day. And we as a team are super delighted to share that Mr. Taranjit Singh Sandhu, Ambassador of India to the United States, will be our chief guest and will be honoring our event. And Mr. Randhir Jaiswal, Consulate Journal, New York, will be our guest of honor on November 13th for the special celebration of Ayurveda Day. And this program is going to start at 12 o'clock, 12 to 2:30 p.m. We have panel
2
discussion
p.m.
also during that, and where you can look or where you can watch this program live. For that, please register at the event page. For the event page, go to the Council for Ayurveda Research Facebook page, and all the details has been posted over there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all once
Thank
again. See
you.
you tomorrow, Diana.
All right. Yes. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye. Namaste. You stay. Okay, I'm stopping. Stop recording.
Facebook Live stop.